My name is Jessica Colnago, and I'll be presenting our work exploring what we called the reverse privacy paradox. This work was done at Carnegie Mellon University with Alessandra Quisti and Laura Craner. Before I start presenting our work, I want to quickly discuss the privacy paradox to ensure we're on the same page. This phenomenon refers to the discrepancy between people's perspectives about privacy and their actual behaviors. On one hand, we've seen reports of heightened expressions of concern about privacy, but also reports of fairly low adoption of tools that are supposed to be privacy protective. Whether this discrepancy is a paradox is moot. The key is to study if an attitude-behavior dichotomy can arise and when, and if so, why. Explanations of the paradox include that generic privacy attitudes, which are broad in nature, cannot be expected to predict actual privacy behaviors, which are contextual, specific, and nuanced. That even in the comparison of specific mental states and specific behaviors, we will see this mismatch due to cognitive biases and heuristics in decision-making under bounded rationality, information asymmetry, privacy calculus, and even quantum theory homomorphism. Well, what about the reverse privacy paradox? We define the reverse privacy paradox as an apparent mismatch between an individual's stated privacy perspectives, captured as attitudes, preferences, or concerns that are interpreted by the observer as a lack of interest, care, or concern about privacy, and that individual's observed or reported behavior interpreted as privacy-seeking. There are a couple of important things to highlight in this definition. The most fundamental part of it being that we're looking at negative perspectives surrounding privacy, in contrast with positive behaviors. The second point being that we're being fairly broad and looking at stated privacy perspectives, which encapsulates attitudes, preferences, and concerns, in contrast with both observed or reported behavior. Lastly, we focus on this being an apparent mismatch and perspectives and behaviors being interpreted in a particular way. With this definition in mind, let's go on to our research. We first conducted a separate study on how to best capture privacy perspectives. You can find the results in our paper titled, "Is it a concern or a preference?" presented at SUPS 2022. This helped ensure we had robust statements that we could use to capture participants' privacy perspectives in our study. And for the sake of time, I will not cover the behavioral elicitation study, but you can check those details in section 4 of the paper. To understand the cases when this mismatch happens, we ran a 3-stage survey, with a subset of participants from each previous stage being selected to participate in the next. Study 1 focused on identifying behavior, engagement, and privacy perspectives, pulling out participants who, based on our definition, display the reverse privacy paradox to be invited for study 2. The first part of the study focused on identifying participants' engagement with behaviors identified in the behavioral elicitation study, and what were their motivations for engaging in those behaviors. Participants were presented with 10 behaviors randomly selected from the list of 77, and were asked to report how frequently they had engaged in that behavior and what was the main reason for having done so. We had on average 36 participants for each of the identified behaviors, with participants having engaged at least once on average in 7.7 behaviors out of the 10 presented. We see that around 77% of the responses indicated engaging in behaviors that can be considered privacy protective. But even though the behaviors were originally collected through a survey designed to elicit privacy protective behaviors and filtered by privacy experts to focus on a range of potential privacy protective behaviors, only 30% of responses in Part 1 categorized the motivation to engage in those behaviors as being primarily associated with privacy. 3 days later, we invited participants back for Part B. This was done to reduce the potential for bias in responses had participants been asked to answer both about their perspectives and behaviors in the same survey. In Part B, participants were shown statements to capture their general attitude towards privacy as well as preference and concern. We also had statements of preference and concern that were created to match the specific behaviors that the participant reported engaging with. Our participants had nuanced privacy perspectives, and their overall view on privacy seemed to be skewed towards being positive and privacy-seeking. Out of the 45 statements meant to capture their perspective, participants responded in a way that could be construed as negative in 4.3 statements on average. There are 2 different types of possible mismatches. General mismatches, which relate to a negative privacy perspective based on the general statements and engagement with any behavior, and specific mismatches, which relate to a negative privacy preference or concern with engagement with the associated behavior. Participants often presented more than one type at a time. While Study 1 aimed at identifying participants who exhibited a mismatch between stated perspectives and behaviors, Study 2 focused on understanding why that mismatch was observed. At the end of Part B, if the participant had displayed any form of mismatch in perspective and behavior, we invited them back for Study 2. Out of the 73 participants from Part B, 52 displayed either general or specific mismatches, and 49 agreed to proceed with the bonus survey. In this part of the study, we asked participants to explain why they thought we observed the gap between their stated perspectives and behavior engagement. For the mismatches observed from general perspectives, participants were presented with all behaviors that they had reported engaging with at least once. For each behavior, they were asked to select from a set of multiple choice options and/or enter their own explanation. The most common reason presented was that engaging in the behavior reduced their level of privacy concern. And this was followed by thinking that sometimes there are situations where it is warranted engaging in the protective behavior. Participants selected other in about 14% of the behaviors, and the vast majority of the explanations they provided matched having engaged in the behavior for a reason other than their own notion of privacy. However, there's also another reason to consider. Since false positives were preferable as we were trying to cast a wide net to identify potential explanations, we defined that any negative general perspective on privacy was sufficient to characterize the participant as holding a negative privacy perspective. This means that we were likely over-indexing on the general mismatches. For this reason, we wanted to confirm whether or not participants agreed with this characterization. Out of the 46 participants reported having engaged in at least one behavior and expressed at least one negative general privacy perspective, 31 disagreed with the assessment that they were not someone who cared or was concerned about privacy. Their explanations for the disagreement were frequently based on caring about privacy in some forms, but not others, and characterizing their level of care and concern as not exaggerated. For the mismatches observed from specific perspectives, participants were presented with only the behaviors that they had reported engaging with at least once, and where a mismatch was observed. There are many explanations for why participants thought that the gap occurred between specific behaviors and their matching statements. One explanation was that participants had engaged in the behavior for a reason that was perceived as unrelated to privacy. For example, this participant disagreed that they worried about sharing their email address, even though they had reported using a secondary email address for specific services. They explain it by saying that their motivation for the behavior wasn't privacy, but to keep themselves organized. In some cases, participants who argued that they had engaged in the behavior for a reason unrelated to privacy offered motivations for their actions that would only be seen as unrelated to privacy if thinking of privacy only as protection of personal data. For instance, this participant who reported not worrying about discussing sensitive topics, but also reported not feeling like talking to certain people who have vastly different opinions than mine, appeared to be willing to modulate their level of openness depending on context. In other instances, participants agreed with the privacy motivation, but had concerns that didn't align with the statements we presented. Sometimes this was due to their concern being different than the one stated, and sometimes because the statements were being overly specific while their behavior was broader. For example, one participant reported not worrying about others observing me while I'm at home, explaining that it's more of a concern of someone coming into my home rather than peeking in through the windows. Another flavor of explanations focused on context and how they may be more or less concerned about their privacy as contextual variables change. Lastly, there were the participants that explained the mismatch as not being concerned, and this explanation came in different flavors. One of these flavors was that participants were not concerned because they felt they had already taken enough steps. Another flavor was that they didn't think the scenario presented was significant enough to warrant being concerned. And finally, their explanation was that concern wasn't the right lens to use. So we arrived on a few explanations for the mismatch we observed. The first two focus on different motivations for behaviors, which is particularly interesting as we collected privacy behaviors from a population sampler similar to our participants. However, our participants often did not construe them as privacy protective. We also observed some participants changing their underlying motivation when explaining the gap. And this could be due to participants thinking about different situations in different parts of the survey, or simply because they reconsidered their initial perspective. The next two explanations focus on different conceptualizations of privacy, and these observations highlight how the remarkable variation of privacy notions, constructions, and definitions commonly observed among scholars is not exclusive to experts. Participants may hold different personal and diverse views of privacy. These notions of privacy may differ both from subject to subject, but also between the subjects and the experts, giving rise to a complex but rich set of privacy notions that should be accounted for when interpreting results of privacy surveys. The next explanation focused on the fact that preferences and concerns are varied, and participants may hold different or at least nuanced versions of what we present them in surveys. In line with what we know about privacy being contextual, another explanation we found was that participants may only care about privacy in very specific situations. Lastly, an explanation we found was that participants may prefer, but not really be concerned about a specific behavior. And this could be because they already take steps to address the concern, or the concern doesn't apply to them, because the situation doesn't warrant becoming a concern and a preference is enough, or because concern is the wrong framing. In a nutshell, we find that participants did engage with many behaviors that could be construed as privacy protective, that a gap in perspectives and behaviors is also common when looking at negative perspectives and engagement in protective behaviors, and that, like the privacy paradox, there are many explanations for the mismatch that are nuanced and need to be explored and accounted for. We also have some recommendations on the right for you to consider when designing a study that captures privacy perspectives and behaviors to mitigate some of the explanations we uncovered for the mismatches.